Hidden away in northern British Columbia is a town where it still feels like 1983. The homes remain fully furnished, the swimming pool is still filled with water, the streetlights continue to shine, yet no one has lived there for more than 40 years. An Indian billionaire purchased the entire town for $7 million and has preserved it almost exactly as it looked on the day 1,200 residents walked away. That town is Kitsault. And believe it or not, it is not even Canada's strangest abandoned place. Today we're exploring 10 abandoned locations across Canada that I honestly believe most people have never heard of. These aren't your typical mining ghost towns or collapsing prairie settlements. We're talking about towns that were literally swallowed by the earth, communities the government paid people to leave behind, places corporations destroyed to erase evidence, and secret sites where assassins were allegedly trained. Canada is filled with forgotten places and haunted histories, yet most of these stories are rarely told. It's time to change that. Number 1 is Kitsault, British Columbia, and this was saved for last because it is arguably the most surreal abandoned place in all of Canada and possibly all of North America. At its peak in 1981, Kitsault had a population of around 1,200 people. Today, there are no permanent residents, only caretakers. The remarkable part is this: the town still exists exactly as it was in 1983, frozen in time because a billionaire chose to preserve it that way. Kitsault is located on the remote northern coast of British Columbia, about 140 kilometers north of Prince Rupert. It is accessible only by boat or float plane. Isolation defines it. In the late 1970s, molybdenum prices surged dramatically. The Phelps Dodge Corporation discovered rich deposits near Alice Arm and decided to build an entirely new town instead of upgrading an older mining settlement. They invested around $32 million to construct a fully planned company town, 92 single-family homes, 200 apartment units, a shopping mall complete with a grocery store and bank, a curling rink, hospital, school, swimming pool, tennis courts, and a recreation center. By 1981, Kitsault was home to 1,200 residents, modern, functional, and purpose-built. Then molybdenum prices collapsed. In January 1983, Phelps Dodge abruptly shut down the mine with very little notice. Residents were given just 90 days to leave. By April, the town was completely empty. But what makes Kitsault unlike any other ghost town is what happened next. The shutdown came so quickly that people left almost everything behind: furniture, appliances, personal belongings, food, even refrigerators. One former resident recalled, "We had 90 days, I took what fit in my car and left. My couch is probably still sitting in that house." Then, years later, something unexpected happened. An Indian-American businessman named Krishnan Suthantheran purchased the entire town in 2004 for roughly $7 million and has maintained it ever since. The electricity has never been shut down. Caretakers continue to move through silent streets. The swimming pool remains filled. Inside, the homes, furniture, dishes, and even televisions from 1983 are still in place. Wall calendars still display dates from 1983. The hospital still contains its original equipment. Some vehicles that were abandoned remain exactly where they were parked more than 4 decades ago. As one caretaker explained, "I walk through empty streets every day. The houses still have furniture, the pool still has water, everything still functions. There are just no people. It's the strangest job I've ever had." Over the years, Suthantheran has put forward several redevelopment ideas: a retirement community, a resort, a liquefied natural gas support hub, even a medical research facility. None of these plans have ever come to life. The town remains locked in 1983, preserved in place while waiting for a purpose that may never arrive. It is not open for easy visitation. The property is privately owned and access is restricted. Yet Kitsault still exists, complete, preserved, and completely empty. And there it is, 10 abandoned places across Canada, each telling stories that are rarely spoken about. Towns poisoned by the same industries that created them. Communities compensated to vanish. Villages erased for military training exercises. Dreams destroyed by endless rain. Land that literally swallowed entire populations. And one settlement frozen in time, maintained by a billionaire for reasons that remain unclear. These places were once homes to real people. They built lives, raised families, and believed in futures that ultimately never arrived. Every abandoned place serves as a reminder that permanence is an illusion. Resources run out, governments fail to uphold promises, corporations erase evidence, and even the ground itself can collapse beneath human certainty. If you have visited any of these locations, or know of other abandoned places in Canada that weren't mentioned, share them in the comments. And if you're living in a town dependent on a single industry and wondering whether history could repeat itself, there is no easy reassurance. It can happen, it has happened, these ruins stand as evidence. Number 2 takes us to Saint-Jean-Vianney, Quebec. This case is different from everything else on this list. The town was not abandoned, it was not relocated, it was suddenly destroyed when the ground itself collapsed beneath it in under 30 seconds. 31 people lost their lives. At its peak, the population was around 1,300 in 1971. Today, it stands at 0. The town no longer exists because the ground it was built on simply gave way. Saint-Jean-Vianney was a working-class suburb of Chicoutimi in the Saguenay region, located about 10 kilometers from the city. It was constructed on clay-rich soil along the Saguenay River, within an area known as the Clay Belt. This region contains marine clay deposits left behind thousands of years ago when the area was still covered by the ancient Champlain Sea. The danger lies in a material known as quick clay. It appears stable and behaves like solid ground, but under certain triggers, heavy rainfall, construction, or vibration, it can liquefy almost instantly. The Saguenay region contains one of the highest concentrations of quick clay deposits in the world. The risk had never been properly evaluated. On May 4, 1971, at approximately around 10:45 p.m., the clay layer beneath Saint-Jean-Vianney suddenly liquefied. In roughly 30 seconds, really let that sink in, just 30 seconds, around 40 homes, along with cars, buses, and streets, were dragged into a massive crater that opened in the ground. 31 people were pulled into the flowing mass of liquid clay. The collapse happened so quickly that entire families had no time to react. One survivor later explained, "I heard a noise like thunder. I looked outside and saw my neighbor's house sliding away. Then the earth opened under my own home. I still don't know how I survived." A bus carrying multiple passengers was swallowed into the crater and was never recovered. One man survived by holding onto his refrigerator as his house disintegrated around him. Several victims were never found and remain buried beneath meters of clay to this day. A geologist involved in the investigation later described it simply: "The ground beneath Saint-Jean-Vianney was a geological time bomb. Once it liquefied, nothing on the surface stood a chance." Surviving residents were evacuated immediately. The town was never rebuilt. Today, a vast crater still marks where 40 homes once stood, an 18-hectare scar on the landscape. A memorial and interpretive site now mark the tragedy. Visitors can stand at the edge of the collapse zone and grasp its scale.
This town was not abandoned by choice.
In total,
it was not
around
evacuated by
6.9
policy.
million cubic
The
meters
earth
of
opened
earth
up
shifted.
and swallowed
31
it
lives were
in
lost.
30 seconds.
A community was erased
31
in less
people
than
died.
a minute. The
Peak
wound in the
population
land
was
remains
approximately
visible.
1,300.
Number 3 takes us to the Gagetown Ghost Villages in New Brunswick. It is a part of Canadian history that has largely faded from public memory. 5 villages, roughly 800 residents, and 150 years of history, all erased so the military could establish a training ground. The area now lies within CFB Gagetown, the largest military training base in the Commonwealth. Petersville, Lawfield, Gaspereau, and Millbrook were once agricultural communities located along the Narrapes River Valley. Families had lived and farmed this land for generations. Properties were passed down through great-grandparents and beyond. Churches had performed baptisms across multiple generations. Cemeteries preserved the remains of ancestors reaching back into the early 1800s. Then the Cold War era arrived. In 1952, the Canadian military declared it required roughly 1,100 square kilometers for a new training installation. The 5 communities happened to sit directly within the designated zone. The eviction process was rapid and harsh. Families were sometimes given only weeks to abandon farms that had been in their lineage for 150 years. The compensation offered was minimal, almost insulting. In some cases, entire farms were bought for as little as $3,000. Burial grounds were dug up and remains relocated, although not all bodies were recovered. Churches were torn down. Houses were intentionally burned as part of military training exercises. This training was for urban warfare, referred to as FIBUA, fighting in built-up areas. One survivor recalled being just 12 years old when he was told his family had to leave. His father broke down in tears, something he had never witnessed before. They stood and watched their barn being burned for target practice. Today, inside the restricted military zone, remnants still exist: broken foundations, overgrown access roads, and the base structures of former churches. Some buildings are still standing and are reused as simulated enemy villages during training operations. Military tanks now move through areas that were once family vegetable gardens. Descendants later formed the Gagetown Expropriation Association, seeking recognition and formal acknowledgement of what occurred. One representative stated that 5 entire communities were erased from the map. Hundreds of people lost everything: their homes, their churches, and their ancestral graves. Occasional heritage visits are permitted for descendants, but access remains tightly controlled. Some zones are still contaminated with unexploded ordnance. In many ways, the villages now exist only in memory and in the concrete remnants beneath ongoing military exercises. What makes this particularly painful is that many of the original residents are still alive today. The 12-year-old boy who watched his family barn burn is now in his 80s, and he still remembers everything. Canada, however, has largely moved on. Number 4 is not a single place, it is more than 300. The Newfoundland resettlement ghost towns represent one of the most unusual chapters in Canadian history, a period when the government directly paid citizens to leave their communities behind. In total, over 28,000 people were relocated from more than 300 settlements, leaving those areas with a population of 0 today. For generations, Newfoundlanders lived in small coastal outport communities spread along thousands of kilometers of shoreline. These were not failed towns, they were thriving settlements of 50 to 500 residents, often reachable only by boat, each with its own culture, dialect, and identity shaped around the cod fishing industry. Some of these settlements had been in existence for centuries. Then in 1949, Newfoundland became part of Canada, and the trajectory of life there shifted dramatically. Provincial and federal authorities concluded that modernization depended on consolidation. Remote settlements were labeled inefficient, and delivering public services to them was considered too costly. The proposed answer was a household resettlement initiative that began in 1954. Under this program, the government offered financial incentives, typically between $1,000 and $3,000 per household, for entire communities to relocate to designated regional growth centers. However, there was a condition: communities had to vote. If the majority agreed, the entire settlement was required to move. This applied even to those who voted against it, even to families whose roots stretched back generations. One survivor of the resettlement process later recalled that they were effectively paid to abandon their home. They were told it was in their best interest. Decades later, the memory still lingered. 60 years later, I still dream about the house where I was born. Premier Joey Smallwood, widely regarded as the key architect of the resettlement policy, used a stark phrase to describe the process: "Burn your boats, there is no turning back." In certain cases, this was not metaphorical. In so-called burnt-over districts, buildings were deliberately set on fire to discourage or prevent return. Some families even went so far as to physically float their houses across bays to new settlements rather than abandon them entirely. These actions left lasting scars, not only on the physical landscape but also on collective memory. Traditional fishing knowledge disappeared within a single generation. Local dialects faded. Entire cultural identities were effectively erased in the name of modernization. Today, more than 300 abandoned communities remain scattered along the Newfoundland coastline. Some still contain visible remnants: houses, churches, and fishing stages. Others have been fully reclaimed by forest and sea. In many locations, cemeteries still exist with weathered headstones where family names remain faintly readable. Access to these sites varies widely. Some can be reached by all-terrain vehicle, while others require boat travel or long, difficult hikes. Each year, descendants return for informal come-home gatherings, meeting on the land where their ancestors were once paid to leave. The sense of loss is profound. Open clearings in the forest mark where entire communities once stood. In some places, the sound of the ocean remains unchanged, the same waters where children once played. The resettlement program officially ended in 1975, although the final relocation, Great Harbor Deep, occurred as recently as 2002. In total, Over 300 communities, around 28,000 people, all financially compensated to leave their homes behind. Number 5 is Cassiar, British Columbia, and this one is frustrating because it was not just abandoned, it was deliberately erased. At its peak in the 1980s, the population was around 1,500 people. Today, it is zero, completely empty with almost nothing left behind. Cassiar is located along the Stewart-Cassiar Highway, roughly 150 kilometers south of the Yukon border. Unlike many ghost towns, it is accessible by road, but arriving there reveals very little remains to see. In 1951, large asbestos deposits were discovered in northern British Columbia. The Cassiar Asbestos Corporation constructed an entire company town to accommodate workers who were extracting chrysotile asbestos from an open-pit mining operation. By the 1980s, Cassiar had developed into a fully functional settlement, complete with a shopping center, recreational amenities, a school, a hospital, a curling rink, a ski hill, and well-built residential housing. Employees received strong wages, families were raised there. The community had a reputation for being close, welcoming, and tightly connected. Then global asbestos prices fell sharply while health concerns steadily increased. In 1992, Cassiar Mining Corporation shut down the operation. They did not simply close the gates and leave. Instead, they carried out a complete demolition of the town. Houses were crushed, burned, or transported away. The school was dismantled, the hospital was torn down, and both the recreation center and shopping complex were leveled within a short period after closure. Workers were given only 3 to 4 weeks to leave. After that, they watched as their homes were destroyed by the same company that built them. It gave the impression that the company wanted to erase any proof that the community had ever existed. Officials claimed the demolition was meant to prevent vandalism. However, critics offered a different interpretation. During the 1990s, asbestos-related lawsuits were becoming increasingly common. If the buildings where workers lived and worked were destroyed, so too would be much of the physical evidence. The hospital containing medical records disappeared. The residential homes where families lived with asbestos exposure were also gone. One former resident stated it plainly: the hospital, the school, everything was gone, and many believed the company did not want anyone to be able to prove what had happened there. Several former workers have since died from asbestos-related illnesses. The tailings pond, holding millions of tons of toxic asbestos waste, still remains. As one environmental researcher explained, the tailings pond is a permanent issue. This asbestos will not disappear for thousands of years. They erased the town, but they could not erase the contamination. Today, the Stewart-Cassiar Highway runs through the area where around 1,500 people once lived. Foundations, overgrown roads, and the vast open-pit mine are still visible, but the town itself is gone, intentionally wiped out. The contamination, however, remains indefinitely. The people who may have had legal claims are passing away, while the physical evidence was bulldozed. Number 6 is Camp X in Ontario, and this entry stands apart because almost nothing is left behind. The structures were intentionally torn down. Its history remained classified for many decades. Some even say James Bond was born here, not literally of course, but in a conceptual sense. Camp X was located along the shoreline of Lake Ontario, between Whitby and Oshawa. Today, the location is a quiet public space known as Intrepid Park. There is a memorial and a plaque. Families now walk dogs there and children play across the grass, yet beneath that calm surface once existed a facility where operatives were trained to kill without detection. In December 1941, British Security Coordination created Special Training School No. 103, Camp X, to train Allied spies and saboteurs during the Second World War. It became the first secret intelligence training center in North America. Estimates suggest between 500 and 2,000 agents were trained here, though exact figures remain classified. Instruction covered sabotage, explosives, wireless telegraphy, covert infiltration, and a method known as silent killing, developed by William Fairbairn. The site also contained Hydra, the most powerful radio transmitter in North America at the time, capable of communicating across the globe. From this quiet stretch of Ontario farmland, encrypted messages were exchanged between Britain and North America. Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, is believed to have visited Camp X during the war. Some historians argue that aspects of the Bond universe were shaped by what he observed there. The tools, the techniques, and the ruthlessness of espionage may all trace inspiration back to this place. The training facility was shut down in 1944 as D-Day shifted the focus of operations to Europe. Hydra continued functioning until 1969. After that, the entire complex was deliberately demolished, leaving almost no physical trace. The existence of Camp X remained classified until the 1970s. One report even claims that during training exercises, a recruit killed a taxi driver and the incident was covered up. Whether fully verified or not, many details of what occurred here may never be publicly known. And that is what makes Camp X so unsettling. It is not ruins, it is absence. You stand in a peaceful park today and the only sign that anything ever happened is a single monument. No buildings remain, no complete records exist. The people trained here scattered across the world, many involved in operations that are still classified. A quiet suburban park with no visible past, yet a deeply hidden one beneath it. In a strange way, that is more disturbing than any ruin. Ruins confirm history existed. Here, you only have silence. Number 7 takes us to Antioch, British Columbia, and this one genuinely catches most people off guard. At its height during the 1920s, Antioch was home to about 2,700 residents. That actually made it the third largest city in British Columbia. Third largest. Today there is no population at all and the entire area now resembles a lunar landscape. Antioch is located on the shores of Granby Bay, roughly 140 kilometers north of Prince Rupert. The only ways to reach it are by boat or floatplane. There are no road connections. In the early 1900s, the Granby Mining Company uncovered enormous copper deposits in the region and did what industrial companies often do: they built an entire city from nothing. By the 1920s, Antioch had developed into a fully functioning industrial town. It included a hospital, hotels, a cinema, company-run stores, recreational facilities, tennis courts, and a vast industrial zone dominated by what became the second largest copper smelter in the British Empire. That smelter operated non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers arrived from many regions. Japanese and Chinese laborers were placed in segregated housing, reflecting the realities of Canada in the 1920s. The town even featured a ski hill and a heated swimming pool, a heated pool in a remote mining settlement reachable only by water transport. Then the Great Depression struck and copper prices collapsed. By 1935, Granby Mining shut down operations in Antioch entirely. Workers were given just 2 weeks to leave. One former resident later described it. When the whistle sounded for the final time, the entire town was in tears. We had 2 weeks to pack up and go. Everything we couldn't carry was left behind. The company salvaged whatever assets it could and abandoned the rest. Over the following decades, forest fires swept through the area multiple times, but what makes Antioch uniquely unsettling is what had already happened before its abandonment. The smelter had effectively destroyed the surrounding environment long before the town was emptied. Toxic emissions from copper processing had contaminated the land for kilometers in every direction. Vegetation died off, leaving behind a barren, almost extraterrestrial-looking terrain that is still visible today. The shoreline is now covered in copper slag, dark industrial waste that resembles black sand. The water itself often appears green due to contamination. What remains today is an industrial wasteland. Concrete foundations, smelter ruins, powerhouse structures, coke ovens, and remnants of mining infrastructure. The sheer scale of the ruins reveals how large and active this place once was. The poisoned landscape shows what decades of heavy industry left behind. Today, Antioch has even become a destination for a small number of kayakers, an unusual form of tourism where people paddle through the remains of a dead industrial city, surrounded by land that was effectively destroyed by the very industry that created it. There is an unavoidable metaphor embedded in that scene if you choose to see it. Number 8 takes us to Cape Scott, British Columbia, and this one is heartbreaking in a very different sense. This was not caused by corporate withdrawal or the exhaustion of natural resources. This was the failure of a dream, one that was eventually swallowed by endless rain. At its peak in 1910, the population reached around 200 people. Today, it stands at 0. The area is now part of Cape Scott Provincial Park, but reaching the original settlement ruins requires a 24-kilometer hike through dense old-growth temperate rainforest. This is not an easy destination. In 1897, Danish settlers led by a man named Rasmus Hansen arrived at the northern tip of Vancouver Island with a bold vision. They intended to build a utopian society, a self-sufficient, isolated community at the edge of the world, believing distance would protect them from modern corruption. They truly believed in this vision, and whether it was inspiring or unrealistic is still debatable. By 1910, significant progress had been made. Around 200 Danish settlers had constructed homes, cleared land, established a school, and built a functioning fishing economy. They also engineered a large earthen dike to drain marshlands, an impressive structure that still exists today. Children traveled kilometers through dense rainforest just to attend school. The settlers worked relentlessly, but there was something they underestimated or perhaps chose to ignore. Cape Scott receives more than 5 meters of rainfall every year, over 200 inches, making it one of the wettest regions in North America. Farming was nearly impossible under such conditions. To make matters worse, the British Columbia government had promised them a road that would connect the settlement to the rest of Vancouver Island, allowing trade and supply access. That road never arrived. One settler wrote in their 1913 diary that they had been promised a road, and without it, they felt completely isolated, like islands unto themselves, fearing it would never be built. That fear proved correct. World War I removed many of the younger men, and isolation slowly eroded morale. By the 1920s, most families had already left their claims behind. The final residents departed by 1956. Today, the rainforest has reclaimed nearly everything. Thick vegetation has overtaken former homesteads. Yet if you endure the multi-day trek, you can still discover sudden clearings deep in the forest, old farm plots building foundations, broken fencing, and rusted tools, all remnants of lives once built in this wilderness. The dike still remains, the school foundation can still be traced, and within these ruins lies the end of a dream that may have been impossible from the very beginning. What makes Cape Scott striking today is its haunting beauty. The tragedy is that its beauty exists only because nature has erased nearly everything humans once built there.
Peak population was 5,000 in 1979.
And yes,
current
that was its
population
real
is somewhere
name.
between
At its
70
peak
and
in
100,
1979,
mostly
the population
seasonal.
reached about 5,000
This place sits
residents.
800 kilometers
Today,
north
it
of
fluctuates
Saskatoon,
roughly between
near Lake
70 and
Athabasca,
100 people,
and you
many
need
of them
either a small
seasonal.
plane or winter
Located
ice
nearly
roads to
800
reach it.
kilometers north of
There is no
Saskatoon
regular
near
road
Lake
access.
Athabasca, the
The
town
Cold
can
War
only
built
be
this town,
accessed by
and
small
the end of the Cold
aircraft
War
or
killed it.
seasonal winter ice roads.
Here's the thing about
There is no
Uranium
permanent
City.
highway leading
It was not
in
some
or out.
ramshackle
This
mining
settlement
camp.
was shaped
By the late
Cold War and
1970s,
ultimately
this was a
undone by
fully
it.
functioning community.
What makes
with
Uranium
schools,
City
a
unique
hospital,
is that it was never
a
just
hockey
a
arena,
rough mining camp.
a bowling alley,
By the late
a movie
1970s,
theater,
it had
and a
developed into a
complete
fully
downtown
built
core.
community with schools,
Workers
a hospital,
earned some of the highest
a hockey
wages
rink,
in
a
Canada.
bowling alley, a
Multiple
cinema,
mining
and a
companies
complete
operated
downtown
in the area.
district.
People raised families
Miners here earned some
They
of the
built
highest
lives here.
salaries in the
They
country.
called it the uranium
Several mining
capital of the world.
corporations operated
And for a
across
while,
the region.
that actually meant
Families
something.
lived, grew, and built
Then
their
3 Mile
futures
Island
here.
happened
It was
in
proudly known as the
1979.
uranium capital
Global
of the
uranium
world,
prices
and for a time
collapsed.
that title carried
Nuclear
real
enthusiasm died.
Then came
In June
1979
1982,
and the collapse tied
El
to the
Dorado
3M
Nuclear closed
Island
its
situation.
operations.
Global
What happened
uranium
next
prices
is almost
dropped
hard to
sharply.
believe.
Public
Within
enthusiasm
months,
for nuclear
90%
energy
of the
declined.
population
By
left.
June 1982,
As one former
El
resident
Dorado
described
Nuclear
it,
shut
one
down
day
its
you had
operations
5,000 neighbors.
entirely.
6 months
What
later,
followed
you
is
had
almost
20.
difficult to comprehend.
People just packed their
Within
cars
just
and
a
drove
few months,
away.
about 90%
They did not
of
take
the
everything.
population had left.
That is what makes
One
Uranium
former
City
resident
different
described
from
it
most
like
ghost
this.
towns.
One moment you
The
had
infrastructure is
5,000
still there.
neighbors, and 6
Schools
months
with
later
desks
only
still
about
inside.
20 remained.
The hospital
People
is still
simply
standing,
loaded up their
but is not
vehicles and drove
operated in
away.
over 40 years.
But they did not take
Street
everything
signs,
with them.
traffic
That is
lights,
what separates
fire
Uranium
hydrants,
City from most
all
abandoned
the infrastructure
towns.
of a
Much of its
functioning
infrastructure
city,
is still standing.
all abandoned.
Schools still contain
Houses
desks
were
and
left
classroom
fully
materials.
furnished.
The
People
hospital
took what they
structure
could
remains
carry and
intact,
walked
though it
away
has not
from the
functioned
rest.
for over 4 decades.
The high school
Street
closed
signs,
with
traffic
textbooks
lights,
still in
fire
desks.
hydrants, all the elements
Visiting
of a working
Uranium
city were
City
left
is
behind.
post-apocalyptic tourism.
Homes were abandoned
You are
with
walking
furniture
through a
still
fully built
inside.
town that just
Residents
stopped.
carried what they could
The
and
arena
left the
bleachers
rest.
are rotting.
The high school
The
closed
buildings
with
are
textbooks
severely
still resting on
deteriorated,
desks.
but the
Today,
bones of the
visiting
community
Uranium City
remain.
feels like stepping
Some
into a
residents refuse
post-apocalyptic
to leave.
landscape frozen
Even
in
now,
time.
a handful
Arena
of people
seating is
live there
decaying.
despite the
Buildings
lack
are
of
heavily
services,
worn down, yet the
maintaining
framework of
whatever
the
they
town
can.
still exists.
Existing existing in what used to be
small
a
number
city.
of residents
The
never
radioactive
left.
waste from
Even
mining
today,
operations
a few
remains
people
in the
continue
area.
to live there
The
despite
cleanup is
minimal
ongoing
services,
and
maintaining
incomplete.
what remains of
What
daily
strikes you
life
about
in
Uranium
what was once
City
a full
is how
city.
quickly it all ended. How a
Radioactive
community
waste
of
from past
5,000
mining
people
activity
can
is
simply
still present in the
evaporate
region,
when the
and
single
cleanup
industry that
efforts
sustained them
continue but remain
disappears.
incomplete.
It is a
What
warning
stands out
wrapped
most
in
about
ruins.
Uranium City is
Resources
how
run out,
abruptly its collapse
markets
happened.
change, and if your
The way
town
a settlement
exists
of
for only one
5,000
reason,
individuals can
you
just
would better hope
disappear when the
that
only
reason
industry
lasts.
supporting it collapses
If you've made it
is
this
a stark
far,
reminder
consider
hidden
liking the
inside
video
ruins.
and subscribing to
When
our
resources
channel.
dry up,
It is
markets
completely
shift,
free,
and a town
and we are
depends on
always
a single
improving to bring you
foundation.
even better
Survival
videos
only
about our
works if
country.
that foundation never
Peak
fails.
population was
If you
5,000
have
in
watched this far,
1979.
consider liking
Current
the video
population
and
is somewhere
subscribing to the
between
channel.
70 and
It
100,
is completely free,
mostly
and it
seasonal.
helps us keep improving
This
and
place
creating
sits 800
even better
kilometers
content
north of
about our country.
Saskatoon, near
At number 10, we arrive at Port Radium in the Northwest Territories. But before we go any further, there's something important you need to know. The uranium ore that ultimately contributed to the deaths of more than 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was carried across the Canadian Arctic on the backs of Dene workers. They were never warned that it was dangerous. During the 1940s, the settlement reached a peak population of around 300 people. Today, nobody lives there and the area is still contaminated by radioactive material. Port Radium lies along the shores of Great Bear Lake, roughly 450 kilometers north of Yellowknife. The only way to reach it is by aircraft, and honestly it's probably best not to visit. Back in 1930, prospector Gilbert Labine discovered pitchblende, a uranium-rich ore leading to the creation of Canada's first uranium mine. At first, the mine focused on producing radium for medical purposes. Then the Manhattan Project changed everything. Members of the Dene community from nearby Daling were hired to transport the ore. They carried heavy burlap sacks filled with radioactive material on their backs while loading and unloading barges. Here's the part you'll never forget. Throughout the 2,100-kilometer journey along what later became known as the Highway of the Atom, many workers slept directly on top of those sacks. They referred to the material as the rock that kills because they realized it had strange qualities, but no one ever explained what radiation was. The empty ore bags were later used to repair canoes, insulate tents, and even patch up clothing. Children played on piles of uranium ore as though it was harmless. Decades later, the people of Daling began suffering devastating cancer rates. At one point, nearly every family had lost someone they loved. The community eventually became known as the Village of Widows. One resident later said, "Our men carried the sacks of ore on their backs. They were never told it was dangerous. Today every one of those men is gone. Our village is filled with widows and orphans." In 1998, a group of Dene elders traveled to Japan to apologize to the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Just think about that for a moment. Victims apologizing to other victims for a bomb they never knew they had helped make possible. The Canadian government did not officially acknowledge the health consequences suffered by the community until the 2000s. More than $80 million has already been allocated toward partial remediation efforts. However, around 1.7 million tons of radioactive tailings are still left behind. The mine officially shut down in 1982, but contamination does not recognize shutdown dates.